Well, it was a great night last night in the NRL Grand Final. Had a great weekend of footy with the AFL Grand Final, but you know, politics and policy and debate continues on. And of course, the big issue that's been raging has been about the blackouts in South Australia, the superstorm. You know, was renewable energy to blame? Was it the infrastructure? Well, one person who might have a bit to say about it, South Australian Labor MP and frontbencher, Shadow Minister for Energy and Climate Change. Joining me now, Mark Butler. Mark, thanks so much for coming on Newsday.
Hi, Kristina. How are you?
I'm really well, thank you. Let's go straight to the claims being made today. Greg Hunt has written an opinion piece in the Australian Financial Review. He claims that the demonstrated inability of the South Australian electricity system to cope with major storms means that companies will think twice about investing in that state. Your reaction?
Well, this is just the latest in a series of falsehoods and attempts by this government to exploit a very serious and dangerous event in South Australia for political reasons. And it's frankly quite shameful. We will see a report, a preliminary report, I think, Kristina, from the market operator, the energy market operator, later this afternoon, which will look into the reasons for the statewide power outage that occurred in South Australia last week. But what is very clear is that it had nothing to do with generation. It would have happened whether South Australia was fully generated by nuclear power or by coal-fired power, or whether we had the mix that we do have of gas-fired power and renewable energy. What happened was a 50-year storm tore up more than 20 transmission towers, causing the system to out. Now, there will be an inquiry into why those towers failed. There will be, I'm sure, questions asked about why the whole of the system in South Australia outed or tripped rather than simply part of it. But none of these questions turn at all on the type of generation that South Australia has. It really was quite an extraordinary attempt by the Prime Minister last week to exploit a very serious and dangerous event in South Australia for purely political purposes. And it must be said, for a political point that had no basis in truth.
Well, you are correct in saying that there will be a number of inquiries looking into this, but we do see already that arguments broken out as to about whether or not the recently closed coal-fired power plant in South Australia could have stopped this blackout. The South Australian state government seems to be pretty clear that it wouldn't have made a difference. Do you think it would have made a difference?
Well, the advice from the state government is that given where the transmission failure occurred, given where the towers went down, that it would not have made a difference. And in actual fact, it might have made things worse because, you know, these things trip when there's an imbalance between the supply of power and the demand for power. In the same way that your household power will trip if a toaster or a hairdryer malfunctions, the system then shuts down in order to protect itself from catastrophic damage, but also in order to protect the community, the safety of the community. So all the advice that we have at the moment is that even if those old coal-fired power stations in Port Augusta were still running, the system would have reacted no differently. If anything, it may well have been worse. But look, the other falsehood in Greg Hunt's commentary this morning is that somehow this was a decision of the state government for those power stations, very old power stations, to close. It must be said this was a decision taken by the company itself, and a decision, I think, taken in the absence of any framework from the federal government about how we are going to see the older coal-fired power stations retire from the system. Firstly, in a way that ensures good, reliable supply of electricity around the country, but also in a way that supports the economic adjustment of those communities. We saw no support to the workers and to the regional community of the Iron Triangle in South Australia from Malcolm Turnbull for months and months after this decision was taken by the company, not by the state government, but by the company concerned.
Well, I'm glad you've raised privatisation because that seems to be a factor that hasn't really been discussed very much in recent days. I mean, we hear that perhaps on Friday there'll be some discussion with Minister Frydenberg and the energy ministers about investing in new interconnectors, you know, upgrading infrastructure. But a lot of this infrastructure has been privatised. You know, who's going to pay for that? And if it is, as it is in South Australia, in private hands, what levers has government got to force that type of investment?
Well, the privatisation debate does continue to rage here in South Australia, and it has over the last several months, because it is quite clear, it would appear, that some of the decisions taken by the former Liberal government around the privatisation of the electricity supply here in South Australia have had ongoing ramifications, particularly their decision not to proceed with an interconnector to New South Wales, between South Australia and New South Wales, was taken as an attempt to fatten the pig, if you like, before ETSA, the Electricity Trust of South Australia, was sold by the former Liberal government. So this is a decision that almost 20 years on, Kristina, continues to rage in South Australia. But I think you will see arising out of the event last week here in Adelaide that there will be a discussion about the transmission network here in South Australia, and also a further interconnection between our state and the state of New South Wales. And those will have investment ramifications for the networks. Again, nothing to do at all with the type of generation that we have here in South Australia, all about the poles and wires system, if you like, that moves electricity around the state and around the national electricity market.
Now, Minister Hunt and Minister Frydenberg have both seized upon this this storm and the aftermath of it in order to argue for harmonisation between the states and the Commonwealth and the territories when it comes to renewable energy targets. In your view, is there a need to have some type of harmonisation, and what would it achieve?
Well, I think everyone's preference, the industry and the states, as well as federal Labor's, would be for there to be an ambitious renewable energy target for the 2020s, so up to 2030, if you like. Now, at the moment, the federal government has no plans for renewable energy building beyond 2020, probably beyond 2019 for that matter, and they have continually turned their face against there being any support for renewable energy beyond the next few years. Now, in the absence of a federal policy, you will see states start to move into that vacuum. That's what happened when John Howard resisted renewable energy targets in the early part of the last decade. You saw states start to move into that vacuum, and you're seeing it now. Now, our preference, I think everyone's preference, would be that there be a single national target for 2030. Our position is it should be 50% of Australia's electricity supply. But until Malcolm Turnbull actually takes that lead, it's inevitable that states are going to take positions to their state elections that see renewable energy building in the absence of federal government support.
All right, Mark Butler, well, that's all we've got time for, unfortunately, today, but thank you so much for joining me on Newsday.
Thanks, Kristina.
All right, we're going to take you live now to